The morning Nora spent her last $1.75 on a stranger, she almost didn't stop. She was already late. The number 14 bus came twice an hour at that stop on Clement Street, and she'd run 3 blocks in her work shoes to catch it. Her lunch bag swinging against her hip, her uniform smelling faintly of the industrial detergent the nursing home used on its linens. She had exactly $1.75 in her coat pocket. She'd counted it that morning at the kitchen table while her daughter Bria slept, because the bus required exact change, and she had learned not to leave things like that to chance. There was a man at the stop. He was old, maybe 70, maybe older. He wore a grey coat that had been good once and a pair of dress shoes that were cracked across the toe. He had a paper bag folded under one arm, and he was looking at the fare machine with the expression of a person who already knows the answer to the question they are asking. His wallet was thin. He held it open and turned it once, and the light through it showed nothing. Nora had 40 seconds before the bus closed its doors. She reached into her pocket. She would tell people later, in the way people sometimes tell stories to themselves when they are trying to understand a choice that changed everything, that she did not think about it. That was true. There was no calculation. There was only the old man's wallet, thin as paper in the morning light, and her hand already moving, and the coins landing in the tray before she had finished the thought. "For you," she said. "Go ahead." He looked at her. His eyes were dark and steady, the kind of eyes that had seen a great deal and were slow to be surprised. He said, "Are you sure?" And she said she was, and the bus driver, who had watched all of this with the patience of a man who had seen the best and worst of people at this corner for 11 years, waited exactly long enough. She did not catch the old man's name. She did not ask. He boarded ahead of her, found a seat near the front, and by the time Nora settled into a window seat in the back, he was looking out at the street, and she was looking at her empty pocket, and neither of them spoke again for the 20 minutes they shared that bus. She had no coins for the vending machine that day. She ate her lunch dry and didn't mind it. That was a Tuesday in February, 3 years ago, and Nora did not think much about it again. She had other things to occupy her. The nursing home, Meadow Ridge, where she had worked as a certified nursing assistant for 7 years, kept her on 12-hour shifts 4 days a week. She was good at it. She was patient with the residents in the way that some people are patient without effort, as if the work had not shaped the quality in her, but only revealed what was already there. She learned their names the first week and used them. She brought small things: a crossword folded to the right puzzle, a throat lozenge on a bad cough day, a minute of genuine attention when the shift was busiest. The residents noticed. Her supervisor had written the same 3 words on every annual review for 6 years. Dependable, kind, never complains. When residents grew disoriented in the late afternoon, which happened often, it was Nora who settled them. She had a way of speaking that was neither too loud nor too soft, a way of placing her hand at the centre of a person's back that communicated without words that they were not lost, that someone solid was nearby, that the day was going to keep going at its ordinary pace. Mrs. Patton in room 6 had asked for her by name each shift for 4 years. Mr. Okoro, who had come in speaking very little English, and who had been frightened and proud in the way of a man who had never been helped and didn't know how to start, had relaxed only for Nora, who had understood without being told that dignity in the small things was the whole of what he needed. The work was hard in the way that caring for people at the end of their lives is always hard. It asked for more than most jobs did. It paid less than it should have. Nora had understood both of these things from the beginning and had stayed anyway because the alternative was leaving people she had grown to know in the hands of whoever came after her, and she was not built for that kind of subtraction. Nora was 41. She had been raising Bria alone since Bria was 4, which was to say she had been raising Bria alone for 9 years. Bria's father had left for Cleveland with someone he'd met at a cousin's birthday party, and Nora had sat in the quiet of the apartment afterward and made a list of what she needed and a list of what she had, and she had set about closing the gap between them with the same steady patience she brought to everything. She paid her bills. She paid them late sometimes, but she paid them. She kept a small envelope in the bread box where she put $5 when she had $5 to spare, because she had decided that the bread box was a more trustworthy institution than the checking account she had overdrafted twice in 18 months. Bria was 13 now and a serious reader, and had a way of saying exactly what she meant that made Nora both proud and occasionally afraid for her, because the world did not always receive that quality as the gift it was. She was taller than Nora by 2 inches already, which Nora pretended not to notice, and she had her father's hands and Nora's eyes and a disposition that was entirely her own, calm and deliberate, and occasionally very funny in the dry way of someone who finds everything slightly absurd but isn't bothered by it. She helped without being asked. She made her own breakfast. She folded laundry on Saturday mornings with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that this task was simply part of the shape of the week and required no complaint or commentary. Nora was glad every day for this child. The apartment on Harlow Street was rented, had always been rented. Nora had grown up in apartments and had always known that one day she would own something, a floor plan she could memorize in the dark, a threshold that was genuinely hers. She thought about it the way people think about things they believe in but cannot see yet. She kept a folder on her phone with pictures. A small house. A yard enough for a dog, maybe. A window that caught morning light. A down payment required money she did not have, and a mortgage required a credit history she was still building, and rent was $1,100 a month, which left her, after utilities and Bria's after-school program and groceries and the bus pass and the other fixed costs of keeping a life together, with a margin so thin she counted coins at kitchen tables before work. This was her life. She did not experience it as tragedy. She experienced it as effort, which was different. If you have ever watched a person carry the weight of a life like that with grace and without complaint, you understand the particular kind of dignity that is not granted by other people but grown privately over years of keeping going. Nora had that dignity. She wore it plainly, the way she wore her scrubs, without ornament and without apology. She did not know that the man on the bus had watched her in the window's reflection for the full 20 minutes. His name was Earl Whitfield. He was 73 years old. He was, by the estimate of a business publication that had profiled him twice, worth somewhere between $400 million and $600 million, depending on which properties were counted and at what valuation. He had built that wealth over 40 years in commercial real estate, beginning with a single 4-unit building in a neighborhood that everyone else had written off, and that he had understood, the way some people understand things before the rest of the world has caught up, would not stay written off forever. He had sold that first building for enough to buy 2 more. He had continued in this fashion quietly without much press for 4 decades. Earl did not look like what he was. This was not an accident. He had understood early in his career that looking like what he was invited a kind of attention that consumed more than it returned. And so he wore plain clothes and kept his name off the door of his building and had learned to move through spaces as if he was simply a man going about his business, which he was, only the business was larger than most people guessed. He drove a sensible car, a dark blue sedan with 130,000 miles on it, because he liked the way it felt and saw no reason to replace a thing that worked. He ate lunch at a diner near his office where the counter staff knew him as Earl, who had the fish on Fridays and left a good tip, not as the man whose name was on the deed of 4 buildings within 6 blocks. He lived alone in a house in the hills. He had an office downtown with 3 employees, which was fewer than people expected. He owned buildings in 6 cities and managed them through a holding company with a name no one would connect to him unless they looked very carefully at public records. He had, in recent years, been thinking about what he was going to do with all of it. He had one son, Marcus, who worked in environmental consulting in Portland and came home twice a year and was a decent man and a decent son. He had a younger sister, Vera, who taught 3rd grade and who called him every Sunday. He had been married once for 16 years to a woman named Cecile, who had died of an illness so swift that by the time they understood the shape of it, there was not enough time left to say everything he had meant to say. That was 8 years ago. The house in the hills was still partly hers in the way of houses where someone loved has been. The arrangement of certain things unchanged. A mug on a certain hook, a book left on a certain table, not as a shrine but as the natural sediment of a life that had been shared. In thinking about what he was going to do with his fortune, he had done the things that men in his position did. He had set up a charitable trust. He had funded college scholarships at the high school he'd attended, in a neighborhood that looked the way all such neighborhoods looked, underfunded and still producing people who surprised you. He had donated to the hospital, where Cecile had spent her final weeks. These were the correct and proper actions of a man who had more than he needed and knew it. He did not find them satisfying in the way he had hoped. On the morning of that Tuesday in February, Earl had taken the bus for the first time in perhaps 30 years. His car was in the shop. His assistant had offered to arrange a car service, and he had said no, he'd take the bus, partly because he was curious what it felt like, and partly because he had a particular small stubbornness about being handled, even by people he trusted. He had found the fare machine unfamiliar. He had stood there with his wallet and understood, without embarrassment, that he was the sort of person who no longer carried exact change. The woman behind him had not paused. She had not made a show of it. She had simply put her coins in the tray and said, "For you, go ahead," and boarded behind him. He watched her in the glass for 20 minutes, and she did not look his direction once. When he reached his stop, he stood and turned, and she was looking out her window at the street moving past, her lunch bag in her lap, her expression easy and far away. He thought about saying something and did not, because she had already given him what she had to give, and he was not sure a thank you would add to it, rather than take something away. He stepped off the bus and walked the rest of the way to his office and thought about her, on and off, for the rest of that week. The trouble was that he did not know her name. Earl had told himself, in the way of a man who has not yet fully faced a question, that he would forget about it. That it was a small thing. People helped strangers with bus fare every day. It was not a thing that required him to do anything. He knew, as well as he knew anything, that this reasoning was wrong. It wasn't the amount, it was the quality of the gesture, the absence of hesitation, the nothing extra of it, the way she hadn't waited to see if he was grateful, hadn't angled for any return, had simply filled a gap and moved on. He had been rich long enough to recognize the rarity of that, because when you had what he had, most kindness came attached to something, a wish, a hope, a small invisible thread. Hers had not. He called his attorney about the trust, something he did every month or so, reviewing the direction of the charitable giving, and in the middle of that call he found himself describing the morning without quite meaning to. His attorney, a precise woman named Claire who had worked for him for 12 years and who had learned not to be surprised by him, listened and said only, "Do you know who she is?" He did not. He had an investigator he used occasionally for due diligence on properties. 3 weeks after the bus, he called that investigator and described the morning and the woman, the uniform, the nursing home smell of the coat, the stop on Clement Street, the Tuesday 14 bus at 6:45 in the morning. It took the investigator 11 days. Her name was Nora Wells. She worked at Meadow Ridge Nursing and Rehabilitation, where she had been employed for 7 years. She lived on Harlow Street. She had a daughter named Bria, who was 13. Her credit file showed a renter with no significant assets and a thin but clean repayment history. She had no criminal record. She had no Facebook, but she had a profile on the nursing home's staff page. And in the photo, she was smiling in a way that suggested the photo had been taken by someone who had made her genuinely laugh. Earl read the file twice and set it face down on his desk and sat for a while. The file had 2 pages. He had held larger files representing larger sums and felt less. He was trying to understand why, and the understanding arrived slowly, the way understanding tends to when it is the kind that changes something. The file told him about a woman who had been doing a hard thing well for a long time, paying for it in full, without flinching, without asking for help, without drawing anyone's attention. The credit file showed the thin margin in numbers. The staff page photo showed what the margin had not cost her. Both of these things were true at the same time, and together they said something about a kind of character that Earl had spent his working life believing in without seeing clearly enough. He thought about his first building. He had been 29. He had borrowed more than was comfortable from people who believed in him more than the numbers justified, and he had been so frightened of failing them that he had gone to the building himself 3 nights a week and repaired what needed repairing, rather than letting the costs get away from him. He had not been ashamed of this. He had understood it as the shape of where he was and what it required. He had understood, standing in stairwells with a can of paint at 11 at night, that the difference between people who made it and people who did not was rarely talent. It was most often the willingness to hold on 1 more month, to keep the math from going wrong by 1 more margin, to continue when continuation felt identical to standing still. He had made it, he had held on long enough, and the buildings had risen in value, and the loans had been paid, and he had bought 2 more, and then 3 more, and then he had stopped counting in the way people stop counting when the number no longer represents a threat. He was looking now at the credit file of a woman who was holding on in exactly that way, for exactly those reasons, with exactly that quality of patient, unbowed effort. And she had still, at the bottom of her pocket, on a Tuesday morning, found something to give. He sat with the file for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Claire. He talked with Claire for a long time. He had thoughts about the approach. He did not want to alarm Nora or make her feel she was being watched, which she had been carefully for 11 days, and he was uncomfortable with that and intended to manage it by making the letter as clean and direct as possible. He didn't want the gift to carry his name in any visible way, not because he was modest about it, but because he understood that a gift that carries the giver's name is partly the giver's still, and he wanted this one to be entirely hers. He had a property on Garfield Lane, a small house he had held in the trust portfolio for some years, which had been a rental until a tenant departed the previous summer and which he had been considering what to do with. It was 12 minutes from Meadow Ridge. He knew the neighbourhood. The house was solid, the yard was real, and the kitchen window faced east. He told Claire what he wanted. Claire said she would handle it. Nora's spring was difficult. Meadow Ridge's parent company announced in March that it was restructuring operations at several facilities, which was the word they used for reducing staff and increasing patient-to-aid ratios to a number that Nora, who understood what that number meant in practice, found troubling. She was not let go. 3 of her colleagues were. She absorbed part of their caseload, which she did without complaint, because the residents had not done anything wrong and she was not going to let them feel the administrative turbulence in the quality of their care. She covered for a colleague who was out sick for 2 weeks in late March and took only 1 day off herself, which she used to attend a parent-teacher conference and stop by the grocery store and fix a leak under the kitchen sink that she'd been nursing along for 6 weeks with a folded washcloth and a pot. She fixed it herself, watching a video on her phone twice before she started, lying on the kitchen floor with her tools spread around her. The pipe held. She stood up and washed her hands and made dinner. Bria needed new shoes in April. The ones she had were fine for another month, maybe 6 weeks. Nora bought them in April, pulling from the bread box envelope because she could see the way Bria walked when the shoes pinched, and she was not willing to let another month pass. She spent $43 on a pair that were plain and well made and would hold up. Bria wore them the next day and didn't comment on them, which was how Nora knew she'd been right about the timing. The bread box took until June to recover. In May, the landlord raised the rent on Harlow Street by $120 per month, effective August 1st. He gave 60 days' notice, which he was required to do, and he was apologetic about it in the way of a man who has done the calculation and landed somewhere uncomfortable, but comfortable enough. Nora thanked him and went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and did the math. And the math said she needed to move. She was not panicked. She was tired. She spent 2 weeks looking at listings. She did it after Bria went to bed, sitting with her phone at the kitchen table with a glass of water, scrolling through numbers that kept coming back wrong. Everything in a reasonable radius of the nursing home, and Bria's school ran $1,200, $1,300. One place asked $1,450, and she had laughed, alone in her kitchen at 11 at night, at a number on a screen. She made inquiries. She answered ads. She filled out applications that asked for income verification, and she provided it, honestly. And she waited. Some of the applications came back as a regretful form letter. Some did not come back at all. She told Bria they might need to move. Bria looked up from her book and asked where. Nora said she was still working on that. Bria said okay and went back to her book because she was 13 and trusted her mother and had learned that her mother's working on it was a serious statement, rather than a deflection. It was in the middle of this that the letter arrived. She almost threw it away. It came in a plain white envelope with her name typed on the front and a return address she didn't recognize. A law firm on Westlake Avenue downtown. She had never had a reason to open mail from a law firm with anything other than dread, and she held it for a moment before she opened it, standing at the kitchen counter with her coat still on. Inside was a single sheet of paper on firm letterhead. The language was formal and careful, the way legal language always was, but its meaning, once she had read it twice, was this. A private trust administered by the firm held a deed to a residential property. The trust settler wished to convey the property to Nora Wells outright, free and clear of any mortgage, lien, or encumbrance, as a gift. There was a phone number to call to begin the process of transfer. She sat for a very long time. Then she called the number. The attorney who answered was a woman named Claire, and Claire was accustomed to questions from people who had received letters like this one, and she answered them with practiced patience. No, there was no mistake. Yes, this was legitimate. No, it did not require Nora to do anything or sign anything beyond the transfer documents. No, there was no attached obligation. No, there was no catch she hadn't been told about. And yes, Claire understood that this was difficult to believe and was willing to wait for however long Nora needed. "Can you tell me who the settler is?" Nora asked. There was a pause. "He's asked to remain anonymous, but he's given me permission to tell you, if you ask directly, that he rode the number 14 bus with you on a Tuesday morning in February." The silence that followed was different from the one before. Nora pressed her hand flat against the kitchen table, a surface she had eaten 1,000 meals at, and she held onto it while the world did something she did not have a word for. She did not cry yet. That came later, alone, after Bria was asleep. She said, finally, "He didn't need to do this." "No," Claire said, "he knows that." The property was a small house on Garfield Lane, 12 minutes from Meadow Ridge, 3 blocks from Bria's school, with a yard not large but real and a kitchen window that faced east. Nora drove past it the day after she called Claire before any paperwork had been signed, because she needed to see it with her own eyes. She parked across the street and sat in the car for a minute. It was a cream-coloured house with a dark green door and a small porch, with room enough for 2 chairs. The yard had a maple tree that was probably magnificent in October, and was bare now in late May, but showed green in the joints of its branches. The kitchen window was visible from the street. The morning light was already moving through it. She drove home and sat at her kitchen table and looked at the bread box for a while. The house visit was on a Saturday morning with Claire, who had brought the key and a folder of documents and who was a practical person with good shoes and a manner that made the improbable feel manageable. The floors were hardwood throughout. The walls needed paint in the second bedroom, a yellow that had gone slightly wrong with age. The kitchen had been renovated sometime in the last 5 years, and the cabinets were solid and deep. There was a small bathroom off the main bedroom that still had the original fixtures, which were old but sound. The basement was dry and had a washer-dryer hookup that the current setup on Harlow Street did not. Nora stood at the kitchen window for a long time. She was looking at the yard, at the maple tree, at the strip of morning sky between the roofline and the neighbour's fence. She was thinking about the bread box. She was thinking about Bria's shoes. She was thinking about February. Claire stood behind her at a respectful distance and did not interrupt. The transfer was completed 6 weeks later. Claire handled it, and Nora's only cost was the attorney's fee for reviewing the transfer documents, which was $250, and which she paid from the bread box, which she had by then replenished. She signed her name on the final page of the deed, and Claire placed a copy in her hands. And that was it. She owned something. A threshold that was hers. Bria walked through every room twice on the first visit, and pronounced the yard sufficient for a dog, which made Nora laugh in the particular way that belongs to relief, and the relief was large enough that it spilled over into something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not long after the transfer completed, Nora received a second letter from the firm. This one contained a handwritten note, a single index card in the careful script of a man who had done things by hand for a long time. It said, "You put your last coins in the tray for me without asking anything and without waiting to be thanked. In 40 years of business, I have learned that a person who gives from the bottom of their pocket gives more than a person who gives from the top. I would have liked to say this on the bus, but did not want to interrupt what you had already said perfectly. I am glad you have the house. I hope it becomes what a house should." She kept the card in the bread box, which she moved to the kitchen on Garfield Lane. He did not introduce himself to Nora in any direct way, and she did not seek him out. She had Claire's number, and she used it once to send a message back, 2 sentences on a note card. It said she did not know how to match what he had done, and that she would try to do the same for someone else, someday, when she was able. Claire forwarded it. Earl read it twice and filed it in a manila folder he kept for things he intended to remember. What she did not know, and what he did not think it useful to burden her with, was that he had done what he'd done entirely, because of what it cost her. If she had been a woman who could spare $1.75 without noticing, the gesture would have been pleasant, but unremarkable. He had read the credit file. He had understood the bread box. He had understood what the coins in that tray actually represented, what the afternoon without a vending machine meant, what the $1,100 a month meant, what the margin between those coins and everything else in her life was. That was the whole of it. The weight of a kindness Earl had long believed was proportionate to what the giver could not afford to lose, and hers had been given with everything she had in her pocket on that morning. He didn't think he was repaying a debt. He thought he was recognizing the weight of a fact. His attorney Claire had asked him gently, near the end of the process, whether he wanted any acknowledgement. A letter, a meeting, a chance to see how it landed. He had thought about it for a moment. Then he had said no. He would know that the house was there. He would know that the window caught the light. That was enough. Nora moved to Garfield Lane on a Saturday in late August, 2 weeks before school started. Bria carried boxes with the focused efficiency of a 13-year-old who wanted this to be real and was making it real through effort. They had not hired anyone. They had filled Nora's car 3 times and a borrowed minivan twice. By noon, the furniture was in, and by mid-afternoon the kitchen was arranged, the bread box on the counter near the window, the dishes put away in the deep cabinets where they had more room than they had ever had. A neighbour across the street came out with a plate of walnut cookies, and did not ask questions, only said she was glad someone was in the house again. It had sat empty too long. A woman down the block had a dog, a small brown dog of no particular breed, who trotted across the lawn and sat at Bria's feet and looked at her, and Bria looked back, and the conversation between them was entirely settled. Nora opened every window in the house that first afternoon. She had always kept the lights low on Harlow Street, partly to save on the electric bill, and partly because bright rooms had seemed for a long time like something for later. She did not keep them low on Garfield Lane. She left the kitchen light on after dinner the first night, in the warm yellow way of a kitchen that does not need to account for itself, and she sat at the table with a cup of tea and looked at the wall that needed paint in the east bedroom and thought about what colour it should be. She was still sitting there when Bria came in with a book and sat across from her without being asked, in the way of children who understand, without being told, that their parent needs company in a particular quiet way. They sat together while the street outside went dark. Nora thought about the bus. She thought about the man with the thin wallet and the cracked dress shoes, and about the 20 minutes she had not thought about him, and about the 3 years she had not thought about that morning at all. She thought about what it would have meant to have done the calculation first, to have weighed the $1.75 against the vending machine and the thin margin and the bread box. She was glad she had not. Not because of the house, though. The house was real and solid around her, and she was grateful for it, in a way she would spend years learning to fully hold. She was glad because of who she had been in that moment, which was simply herself, with her hand already moving and the coins already in the tray. There was something she wanted to tell Bria about it. She had not found the right words yet. They would come. She was patient. She was good at waiting for the things she needed and trusting that they arrived in their own time. She thought about the index card in the bread box. I would have liked to say this on the bus, but did not want to interrupt what you had already said perfectly. She had not said anything. She had put coins in a tray. She understood now that this was what he meant, that sometimes the thing you give says everything, and the adding of words would only diminish it. If you've ever done a small thing without thinking, without waiting for a witness, without calculating the cost because the cost was already paid by the simple fact of who you are, then you know what Nora knows. Those things don't disappear. They go somewhere. The world keeps a longer account than we imagine, and the ledger is not always legible to us, but it is kept. Nora stayed at Meadow Ridge. She was offered a raise in September, a modest one, and she took it with the even gratitude of a person who had stopped expecting things and started receiving them. The residents she worked with that fall did not know about Garfield Lane, but they noticed something in her, a groundedness, a particular unhurried quality in the way she moved through the halls. Mr. Briggs, who was 91 and who had been known for his difficulty, told her one afternoon that she was the kind of person the building was better for. He said it grudgingly, because he was 91 and had earned the right to give compliments at his own pace, and she thanked him and straightened his blanket and went on with her day. She got the dog in October. A small brown dog, not the one from across the street, but one in the same family of small brown dogs of indeterminate ancestry, found at the shelter where Bria had spent 3 Saturday mornings looking. Bria named him Bus. She said she named him after the route they took to the shelter, and Nora did not correct her because she understood that both things could be true at once. Bus slept at the foot of Bria's bed and ate methodically and had the serene and certain temperament of an animal who understood that he had arrived exactly where he was supposed to be. He followed Nora into the kitchen in the mornings and sat near the window while she made coffee, patient and quiet, watching the yard in the way of dogs who take their small pleasures seriously. Did you know that $1.75 can change a life? Drop a comment if you believe that kindness given quietly always finds its way back. Stay close because we have another story, just like this one, waiting for you right after. Nora painted the east bedroom a warm cream, 2 coats on a Sunday when Bria was at a friend's house. She did the trim herself with a small brush, taking her time at the corners, in the quiet of a house that was hers to take time in. The colour in the morning light was the colour of the index card in the bread box, though she had not planned that. She noticed it later and did not say anything about it to anyone. She kept $5 in the bread box still. Old habit. The box was no longer an institution with greater weight than the checking account. It was just a bread box in a kitchen that was hers, with a window that caught the light. There was always $5 in it, just in case someone needed something she could spare. She had learned on a Tuesday in February that you never knew who was watching. Not in the fearful way, the performative way, the way that makes a virtue into a transaction. In the other way, the way that simply means the world is more connected than it looks, and that the thread you cannot see is sometimes the most important one, and that a person doing a plain and decent thing in an ordinary moment is doing it in front of the whole of what they cannot know. That was enough. That had always been enough. She kept the light on in the kitchen. She let the morning come. Bria found her there one morning in early November, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee. Bus at her feet, the yard still and bare except for the maple, which had shed its leaves but kept its shape against the sky. Bria poured herself a glass of juice and came to stand beside her and looked at the same yard, at the same tree, and did not ask what Nora was looking at. After a while, Bria said, "Do you like it here?" "I do," Nora said. "Me too," Bria said, and went to get her book, and that was the whole of the conversation, which was all it needed to be. Nora stood at the window a little longer. The morning was grey and quiet, the kind of November morning that did not promise anything but delivered itself steadily, hour by hour. She thought about the bus, one last time, and then she let it go, the way you let go of the thing that saved you once you are sure you are saved, holding it not in the grip of relief, but in the open hand of gratitude. She had given what she had, the rest had come. This story is inspired by true acts of grace and is presented here as a work of fiction to honour the spirit of such moments.